your brief focused very much on, I think, the relevant question of the day, which is what we're dealing with right now is mostly Omicron. Delta's still out there. It's not to say it's gone, but now, and certainly very soon from now, it's going to be all about Omicron. So we need to deal with that. And it did come up on Friday's hearing, but to me, it seemed like the liberal justices weren't even aware of the differences between Omicron and Delta, and how you could still get, even when it was Delta, you could still get Delta despite the fact that you were vaccinated. But with Omicron, it's almost like the vaccine does nothing to prevent the transmission. It still prevents, in most cases, severe disease or death. And that's good. That's why most people choose to get vaccinated. But when we're talking about mandating it from your employer, they're trying to stop contagion.
Correct. That's exactly right. What we argue in our brief, and I think the evidence is now overwhelming on this point, is that there is a benefit to vaccination, but it's a personal benefit. It is not a public or societal benefit because it only reduces disease severity. It does not reduce your chances of catching the virus or transmitting it to others. And that really undercuts the entire rationale for these mandates. And it's also really important to respect people who choose not to get the vaccine, because that's a very personal decision. There is a risk of adverse events, especially if someone's already been infected. That changes the calculation. You don't know their cardiac history. That's something that people should decide with their doctors, not by politicians and bureaucrats dictating what's best for everyone. And I think that if you stop thinking about this idea that there's going to be this grand societal benefit, which I think the evidence now shows there won't be, it should be very clear that the right way to think about this is as a personal decision, a personal, private health decision that individuals should be able to make with the advice of their doctors. And, I think the evidence on this point right now with Omicron, and we walked through all of this in our brief, it's really overwhelming. There does seem to be a time-limited reduction in transmission and the risk of becoming infected, but it seems to wear off after only 60 or 90 days after the second shot, and maybe
you're talking about Delta
after a third shot. So after that, in fact, we see in a lot of these countries, the protection goes negative. You're more likely to get it than someone who's unvaccinated after 60 or 90 days in the Danish and the Canadian data.
Let me ask you that. I saw that in your brief. Yeah. That's an important point. And so you're saying that the Danish and what was the other one? UK?
Canadian. It was specifically Ontario.
Okay, so they concluded that after 60 to 90 days, you're more likely to contract COVID if you've had the vaccines than if you haven't. I read that in your brief. But is there an asterisk to that latter point saying if you haven't and you have natural immunity?
Yeah, they didn't break the data up in either of those studies. And I suspect that you've put your finger on exactly what's happening here, which is the unvaccinated group probably has a lot more natural immunity than the vaccinated group, which is why they're getting infected less. When the vaccine immunity sort of wears off and gets closer to zero, you get more of a comparison of the group with more previously infected versus not previously infected. So to me, most likely it's waning to zero, and then you're getting a composition effect from more natural immunity. But we really don't know why the data is showing what it is. And there are some plausible mechanisms that could actually cause reduced immunity if you have things like antibody-dependent enhancement. And there are physical mechanisms that could cause negative vaccine effectiveness, but I'm not sure that we actually see any evidence of those. It is very possible that it's just what you suggested, that it kind of wanes to zero, and then you have a different composition in terms of natural immunity. But neither of those studies broke that out, so we don't. Well,
let me ask you about wanes to zero too. The last I looked at this was when I had Scott Gottlieb on, former FDA commissioner who now is on the board of Pfizer, and he's touting the vaccines and he's touting the mandates. And I'm telling him a study just came out that day that was published in The Lancet about the Pfizer vaccine, showing that after 6 months post your second dose, it had only a 47% effectiveness at preventing COVID, which is not good. And he claimed he hadn't seen it, blah, blah, blah. But that's not so good. And it certainly seemed like, based on the Israel study and other data, you'd be better off 6 months post a COVID infection at fighting off a second infection than 6 months post your second Pfizer vax. But you're using zero. Where does that come from?
Well, the studies we were just talking about for Omicron, we see that the observed vaccine effectiveness goes negative, which means you're probably not getting any protection at all, from the vaccine, even if you were able to correct for those, confounders.
In terms of contagion.
Think that one of the issues we've got right now, Megyn, is they haven't updated this vaccine. And so you're using a vaccine that essentially expresses the spike protein of a 2-year-old now extinct virus, while something very different is what's circulating right now. It's as if they were mandating you use, the flu vaccine from 5 years ago instead of using this year's. You might get some effect, but it's going to be pretty small and short-lived. And so I think one of the real failures of the Biden administration, and all they do is talk about vaccines all day long, but when we had the sequence for this, they didn't make any expedited effort to actually get a vaccine that was specific to it available. And we're still using this one that was designed for a very different virus.